I still remember the exact weight of that envelope. Not heavy. Not dramatic. Just a standard manila folder sliding across a polished oak desk like it was nothing more than a utility bill. My father's lawyer didn't even look me in the eye when he said the words out loud. $1. To teach you a lesson. The room went quiet in that heavy, suffocating way that only happens when everyone pretends not to notice you're breaking. My brother was sitting right across from me, adjusting his watch like he'd already moved on to the next agenda item. He got the lake house. He got the family trust. He got the signature that said, "Proud of you," in permanent ink. I got a single dollar bill and a note that sounded more like a verdict than a farewell. I didn't cry. Not there. Not in that room with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the lawyer shuffling papers like he'd seen this exact scene 100 times before. I just folded the dollar bill into my pocket and walked out to the parking lot. The asphalt was still warm from the afternoon sun. I remember leaning against my car, pressing my palms flat against the roof, and realizing something I should have figured out years ago. This wasn't about money. It was never about money. It was about control. It was about making sure that even in death, he could still reach across the years and remind me exactly where I stood in his hierarchy. The favorite child gets the keys. The quiet one gets the lesson. I drove home in silence. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just let the road stretch out and tried to untangle the knot in my chest. People talk about grief like it's a sudden storm. They don't tell you about the slow erosion. The way you spend years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never built for you. I used to think if I just worked harder, spoke softer, asked for less, maybe I'd finally be seen. Maybe I'd finally be enough. Turns out, some people don't want you to be enough. They just want you to stay small. I put the dollar bill in a drawer. I didn't throw it away. I couldn't. It felt like keeping a receipt for a debt I never agreed to. 3 weeks later, my lawyer called me back. Not the estate attorney. Mine. The one I hired quietly, after I noticed how neatly my father's assets had been divided before he even passed. She had that calm, deliberate voice that only comes from people who've learned how to read between the lines. She said she found something tucked behind the false panel in his filing cabinet. A second envelope. Thicker. Sealed with wax. Labeled in his handwriting, but not addressed to the estate. Addressed to me. She didn't say what was inside. She just told me to come to her office and to bring the dollar bill with me. I remember sitting in my kitchen that night, staring at my own reflection in the dark window, wondering if I was finally going to get the truth or just another layer of the same old game. I knew my father. I knew how he operated. Every gesture had a ledger. Every word came with a price tag. If he left me a second envelope, it wasn't out of love. It was out of strategy. And I was tired of playing by rules I didn't write. I drove to the lawyer's office the next morning. The sky was gray. The kind of gray that feels like it's holding its breath. I parked, walked through the glass doors, and sat in the same chair I'd sat in 3 weeks earlier. This time, the desk felt different. The air felt different. She slid the envelope across to me. No dramatic music. No cinematic pause. Just paper. Thick paper. Heavy. I ran my thumb over the edge. It hadn't been opened. The wax seal was cracked slightly from age, but intact. My hands didn't shake. Not yet. I just looked at her and asked if she knew what was inside. She said she hadn't read it. She said it was addressed to me. She said she'd witnessed it alongside the original will, but my father gave strict instructions that it could only be opened after the dollar was accepted. Not refused. Not argued over. Accepted. I laughed. A quiet, hollow sound. Of course. Even in the afterlife, he wanted me to follow the script. I broke the seal. The paper inside smelled like old tobacco and cedar. I unfolded it slowly, and the first line hit me like a physical weight. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up at my lawyer. She was already watching me. She didn't ask what it said. She didn't have to. The way my hands finally started to tremble told her everything. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a confession, and it changed everything. I read the first paragraph again, and then the second. The handwriting was unmistakable. The same sharp slant he used on birthday cards he never handed to me himself. The same deliberate loops he used when he was trying to sound sincere. But this time, there was no performance. Just paper. Just ink. Just a man finally writing the truth because he knew he'd never have to say it out loud. He admitted he'd kept 2 ledgers for my life. One for the family. One for me. The family ledger had the vacations, the college fund, the public praise, the careful choreography of a perfect son and a quiet daughter who was just there to balance the frame. My ledger had the notes he never sent. The hospital visits he skipped. The times he watched me from across the room while I explained my choices to my mother and nodded like he was listening but never once asked if I was okay. He wrote that the dollar wasn't a punishment. It was a key. He called it a threshold. He said he knew I'd either take it quietly and disappear into the background like I always had, or I'd finally stop waiting for a permission that was never coming. He needed to see if I'd still play the part of the good child when the stage lights went out. He needed to know if I'd finally walk away from a table that only fed my brother. I sat in that chair and felt the room tilt. Not because I was angry, because I was tired. Tired of decoding a language that only ever spoke in negatives. Tired of translating silence into love. Tired of making myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. My lawyer didn't interrupt. She just let the paper breathe. She handed me a manila folder from her drawer. Inside were bank records, property deeds, a timeline of transfers going back 12 years. My father hadn't just divided the estate when he died. He'd been moving pieces long before. The lake house wasn't a gift. It was a shield. The trust wasn't a legacy. It was a wall. And the dollar wasn't a lesson. It was a mirror. He wanted me to look at it and decide what kind of life I was still willing to accept. I traced the edge of the transfer documents with my thumb. The dates lined up with every time I'd been told to wait. Every time I'd been asked to be patient. Every time I'd been reminded that family comes first, even when family comes with conditions I never signed. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt relieved. Because finally, the math added up. Finally, the silence had a source. Finally, I could stop wondering if I was the problem and start seeing the pattern for what it was. A design. A quiet, careful design built to keep me in place while my brother inherited the spotlight. I looked at my lawyer and asked what happens now. She didn't smile. She didn't soften. She just said we don't fight the will. We follow it. We accept the dollar. We open the second envelope. And then we do what he never expected. We read it out loud. To the people who were supposed to be there when it mattered. We put it on record. We let the truth sit in the same room where the lie was signed. I nodded. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I wanted clarity. I wanted the version of my life that hadn't been edited down to fit someone else's comfort. I drove back to my apartment that evening with the folder on the passenger seat. The streetlights flickered on one by one. I didn't turn on the radio. I just let the engine hum and thought about all the times I'd rehearsed conversations in my head that never happened. All the times I'd swallowed my voice so the house wouldn't get too loud. All the times I'd mistaken endurance for loyalty. The dollar was still in my pocket. I pulled it out and smoothed it against my knee. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't dramatic. It was just paper. But it was mine. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was borrowing my own life. I felt like I was finally holding the receipts. I didn't call my brother. I didn't call my mother. I just let the documents sit on my kitchen table for 3 days. I made coffee. I drank it cold. I watched the light shift across the hardwood and tried to piece together a timeline that had been quietly rewritten while I was busy trying to earn a place at a table that only ever saved me the last seat. The bank statements showed transfers. Not big, flashy withdrawals. Just steady, methodical moves. A 0.25% shifted here. A beneficiary changed there. A trust restructured under a clause I'd never heard of until I read it in plain black ink. It wasn't theft. It was architecture. He built a financial maze and handed me a single dollar as the map. My lawyer called it strategic misdirection. I called it exhaustion. The kind that settles in your ribs and makes every breath feel like you're carrying a room full of furniture you never agreed to buy. I started digging into the dates, cross-referencing them with family milestones. The summer he sold the lake house vacation rights and told me it was a market downturn. The exact month my brother got his first business loan backed by a family guarantor. The week I was told to be grateful for the car I'd already paid off. Every time I thought I was being asked to compromise, someone else was being handed the keys. I didn't scream. I didn't break anything. I just opened a notebook and started writing down every conversation I could remember. Every time I'd been told to wait. Every time I'd been praised for being easygoing. Every time my voice had been politely interrupted while my brother's opinions were treated like gospel. The notebook filled up fast. Not with rage. With receipts. I took it to my lawyer. She read it without blinking. Then she slid a new folder across the desk. This one wasn't about money. It was about intent. Emails. Drafted but never sent. Voice memos recorded on an old device he kept in his study. Handwritten notes tucked inside ledger books. He hadn't just moved assets. He'd documented his reasoning. He wrote that he knew I'd never ask for more. That I'd always rationalize the silence. That I'd call it family loyalty instead of what it was. Emotional rationing. He needed me to stay soft so the family narrative stayed clean. If I broke, the story broke. If I demanded fairness, the illusion of harmony cracked. So he gave me $1. A test wrapped in humiliation. He wanted to see if I'd finally stop apologizing for existing in the margins. I sat in that chair and felt the weight of it all. Not the anger. The clarity. The moment you realize you've been negotiating with a ghost who already made up his mind. I asked my lawyer what the legal path looked like. She didn't sugarcoat it. She said the will stands. The dollar is legally binding. The second envelope, however, changes the narrative. It doesn't override the estate. It recontextualizes it. We don't need to fight the distribution. We need to present the full record. We schedule the reading. We invite the family. We let the second envelope sit on the same table where the first was handed out. We don't argue. We don't perform. We just read it aloud and let the silence do the work. I agreed. Not for revenge. For closure. For the version of myself that spent years shrinking to fit a space that was never mine. I went home that night and packed a bag. Not to leave. To prepare. Ironed the dollar bill. I placed the second envelope on top of my notebook. I looked at myself in the mirror and finally stopped asking why I wasn't chosen. I started asking why I'd kept waiting to be. The reading was set for Thursday. 4 days away. I didn't sleep much. Not because I was nervous. Because I was awake. For the first time in my life, I wasn't rehearsing how to make other people comfortable. I was rehearsing how to finally be honest. I walked to the post office on Tuesday. Mailed a copy of the second envelope's contents to my brother. No note. Just the truth. Let him read it in his own time. Let him sit with it. Let him realize the inheritance wasn't the lake house. It was the illusion of being the favorite. I came back to an empty apartment, made tea, sat by the window, watched the streetlights flicker on, and waited, not for an apology, for the moment the story finally tells itself. I walked into the reading room 10 minutes early. The wood floor creaked under my boots. Same sound it always made when I was late to dinner, when I was the afterthought, when the house was already full of voices that didn't need mine. My brother arrived first. He wore a suit that looked expensive and uncomfortable. He didn't hug me. He just nodded like we were colleagues meeting to review quarterly reports. My mother came next. She carried her purse with both hands, the way she always did when she was trying to hold herself together. She sat farthest from the table. I understood why. The lawyer arrived last. She placed a leather folder on the desk, aligned it perfectly, and didn't say a word until we were all seated. Then she opened the will. The official one. The one that left me $1 and my brother everything else. She read it slowly. The words didn't sting anymore. They just sounded like what they were. A formality. A record of a choice already made. When she finished, she didn't close the folder. She reached into her drawer and pulled out the second envelope. The room went still. My brother shifted in his chair. My mother looked at the wall. I didn't move. The lawyer broke the seal again, though it was already cracked. She handed it to me. I didn't take it right away. I just looked at them. Both of them. The people who had shaped my entire understanding of love by withholding it. Then I opened it. I didn't read it aloud at first. I just let the pages settle in my hands. The first section was about money. Not the lake house. Not the trust. The accounts he'd quietly funded under my name for years. Scholarships. Emergency medical reserves. A property deed to a small cabin upstate, transferred 5 years ago, never mentioned, never claimed. He hadn't left me nothing. He'd left me a safety net. Hidden behind $1, so I'd have to choose to look for it. So I'd have to stop waiting and start searching. I turned the page. The next section wasn't about assets. It was about me. He wrote that he knew I'd carry the weight of this family longer than anyone else. That I'd apologize for things that weren't mine to fix. That I'd mistake endurance for devotion. He said the $1 wasn't meant to break me. It was meant to wake me up. He said he'd spent my whole life making sure I was strong enough to walk away when the time came. Strong enough to stop asking for permission to exist on my own terms. I looked up. My brother was staring at the table. My mother's hands were trembling. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt exhausted. And finally, free. I closed the envelope. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand an apology. I just said thank you. Not to them. To him. For finally telling the truth. Then I stood up. I picked up my coat. I told my lawyer I'd be in touch about the cabin. I told my brother he could keep the lake house. I told my mother I loved her, but I wouldn't be the quiet daughter anymore. I walked out. The hallway felt different. Lighter. Like the air had finally stopped holding its breath. I drove home with the windows down. The wind hit my face and I didn't try to hold back the tears. They weren't sad. They were just mine. For the first time, I wasn't living in the space between what I was given and what I deserved. I was living in what I decided to claim. I didn't expect the silence to feel so heavy. Not the kind that screams. The kind that settles. Like dust after a storm. I went back to my apartment that night and didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the floor, back against the couch, and let the quiet do what it needed to do. My brother hadn't called. My mother hadn't texted. I wasn't waiting for them to. That was the difference. 4 years, I'd measured my worth by how long I could hold my breath while they figured out if I mattered. Now I didn't need to. The cabin paperwork arrived 3 days later. Thick envelope. Not from the estate. From a trust I'd never heard of. Deed in my name. Property taxes paid through next year. No note. Just the keys and a stamped receipt. I drove up on a Sunday. The road was unpaved. Potholes. Pines leaning over the asphalt like they were tired of standing straight. The cabin smelled like old wood and dried leaves. I walked through each room slowly, ran my fingers over the counters, checked the faucets, opened the windows, let the cold air push out the stagnation. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. It was a place to breathe. A place where no one expected me to shrink. I sat on the porch that evening and finally let myself cry. Not for him. Not for the dollar. For the girl who spent 20 years apologizing for taking up space. For the woman who finally stopped negotiating with a ghost. I unpacked a single bag. Left my phone on the counter. Didn't check messages. Didn't draft replies. I just listened to the wind move through the trees and realized how loud my own mind had been for so long. The next morning, I walked to the edge of the property. The ground was damp. Frost still clung to the grass. I stood there and thought about inheritance. Not the legal kind. The emotional kind. What we pass down without realizing. The quiet sacrifices. The swallowed words. The way we teach our children to love conditionally by calling it tradition. My father thought he was teaching me resilience. He was. Just not the way he intended. He taught me that waiting for permission is a trap. That love shouldn't come with a receipt. That sometimes the only way to prove you're enough is to stop asking the wrong people for confirmation. I came back to the city on Tuesday. Packed the rest of my life into boxes. Not to run. To rearrange. I moved the dollar bill from my pocket to a frame. Not to worship it. To remember it. It sits on my desk now. Next to a pen. Next to a blank notebook. I don't look at it with bitterness anymore. I look at it like a receipt for a debt I finally paid off. My brother called yesterday. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't listen to it right away. I waited. Not out of spite. Out of practice. I've learned that urgency is just anxiety wearing a mask. When I finally pressed play, his voice sounded thinner. He talked about the lake house. About maintenance. About whether I wanted to keep in touch. I didn't hang up. I just said I needed time. Real time. Not the kind we measure in holidays or family group chats. The kind that lets you rebuild your spine before you stand in front of people again. He didn't argue. He just said okay. And for the first time, I believed he might actually mean it. Or maybe I just stopped caring if he didn't. I didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. That was the first real boundary I'd ever set without announcing it. I just let the days pass. Let the unread messages pile up. Let the phone sit face down on the counter while I unpacked boxes, made coffee, and learned the sound of my own footsteps in an empty room. The cabin wasn't an escape. It was a mirror. Every creaking floorboard, every draft under the door, every quiet morning where I didn't have to perform gratitude or swallow my truth, it all forced me to face the version of myself I'd been hiding from. The one who thought love meant staying. The one who confused endurance with loyalty. The one who believed that if she just waited long enough, someone would finally see her. I stopped waiting. I started building. I met with a financial advisor. Not the estate's. Mine. We mapped out the trust accounts. We structured the cabin deed. We set up a separate savings line for the medical reserve my father had quietly funded. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it out of respect. For the woman who finally realized she didn't need permission to protect herself. My brother's voicemail played once more in my head. I listened to it while washing dishes. The water ran warm. The soap slipped through my fingers. He talked about maintenance, about whether I'd be coming for Christmas. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch. Then I typed a reply. Short, clear. No apologies. No open doors. I said I'd be focusing on my own life this year. That I loved him. That I hoped he found peace. That I wouldn't be attending. I hit send. Didn't watch for a read receipt. Didn't refresh the screen. I just closed the laptop and walked outside. The air was cold. My breath fogged in front of me. I stood there and realized something I should have known years ago. The dollar wasn't a punishment. It was a release. He knew I'd never leave on my own. He knew I'd keep making excuses for the quiet favoritism, the sidelined conversations, the emotional rationing. So he gave me a single bill and a closed door. He forced me to choose between staying in the waiting room of someone else's approval or finally walking out into my own life. I chose to walk. And it didn't feel like loss. It felt like breathing. If you've ever sat at a table where your voice was politely ignored while someone else got handed the microphone. If you've ever mistaken silence for love. If you've ever carried the weight of a family narrative that never made room for you. I see you. And I want you to know this. You don't have to prove your worth to people who already decided what you're worth. You just have to stop asking them for the receipt. Drop a single word below if you're finally ready to stop waiting. I'll read every one of them. Because the truth doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be spoken. Once. Loudly. And then left to stand on its own. I didn't wait for the family to adjust to the new version of me. I just kept living it. The cabin became my baseline. Not a retreat. A reset. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. I stopped answering calls that came with expectations I never signed up for. I started saying no without over-explaining. The dollar stayed on my desk. Not as a reminder of what I was denied. As proof of what I finally claimed. My brother sent a letter months later. Handwritten. Short. He said he didn't understand most of it, but he was trying to. I didn't reply. I just folded it and put it in a drawer. Not out of spite. Out of respect for the distance I'd fought so hard to build. Some wounds don't close with words. They close with space. I finally understand what my father was trying to do. He didn't leave me a lesson. He left me an exit. He knew I'd spend my whole life trying to fix a house that was never mine to hold together. So he handed me a single bill and a closed door. He forced me to stop waiting for a seat at a table that only ever fed my brother. He forced me to build my own. I don't hate him for it. I don't forgive him either. I just see him clearly now. A man who loved in spreadsheets, who measured devotion in silence, who thought control was the same as care. I'm not that woman anymore. I don't translate neglect into loyalty. I don't mistake endurance for love. I don't wait for permission to take up space. If you've ever been the quiet one in a loud room, if you've ever swallowed your truth to keep the peace, if you've ever been handed a dollar and told it was a lesson when it was really a test, you don't owe them your silence anymore. You don't have to prove your worth to people who already decided what it was. You just have to stop asking for the receipt. Drop a single word below if you're finally done waiting. I'll read every one of them. Because the truth doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be spoken. Once. Loudly. And then left to stand on its own.